Right. Welcome back to another episode of Career Bound by Praxis. I'm John. This is Mitchell. Excited to be here. Talk about a couple career focused topics today, as we do on Career Bound. Mitchell, I'll get right into it. Uh, we were kind of talking about this. I guess we were starting to think about this last episode, but I've been thinking about it this week too. What are some other factors to consider besides compensation when it comes to choosing your career path? Because that's the primary. Everybody always goes, oh, pay, pay, pay. But there's a lot that goes into it. And compensation is more than just finances. So, what goes into that for you, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that is there's this great book. It's called How to Find Fulfilling Work. It's by a guy named Roman Kursnarek, and he kind of talks about like there's 5 dimensions of meaningful work that drive us all, and there's earning money, there's achieving status, there's making a difference, there's following your passions, there's using your talents. I'd imagine that if we like pontificated on this long enough, we may come up with some others, or at least derivatives of those. But one of the things I love about that is there's this, like even within that short list of 5, there's kind of this natural categorization. There's like the extrinsic factors, so how much money you make, how much status you have.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like the intrinsic stuff, like you feeling like you're making a difference, you feeling like you're doing the thing you were meant to be doing, or you were like fulfilling your potential, following your passions, like you're using your talents, in a way that's impactful to others. Like there's kind of that, and that creates this sort of natural conflict between your intrinsic motivations and your extrinsic motivations. I think that changes, and it's totally reasonable and appropriate that your sort of career value set, or the hierarchy of your career values evolves over time. So like at some phases of your life, making money, pursuing status may naturally just make more sense than making a difference, following your passions, using your talents. And some of those things may seem like luxuries at times. If you're like, if you're middle-aged and you've got a family and you're the breadwinner, you're like, let's say that you're the sole income earner, and you've got a family, multiple kids, you got a mortgage, you got, kind of like the traditional American, financial household makeup, where you've got these financial obligations, and you want to provide a good life for your family and opportunities, and maybe you care a little bit more about money and status at that point. Money because it helps you do the thing that it really is most important to you. Status because that's sort of tends to be loosely associated with security. Like, the more status you have in a particular domain or within a business, like your job is a little bit more secure than if you're lower on the rung. So, maybe that's an appropriate thing. And, maybe while your kids are younger, sort of those other things take a back seat. Okay. This show was focused on the start of your career, and that's what we talk about. And so I'm probably, my perspective on this is maybe not universally well received, but I just think that your 20s are for learning. I think your 20s are for learning. You should be going all out in your 20s. And that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice everything, like your relationships or your social life and friendships and all those kind of things, your health or anything like that. Yeah. But I think oftentimes people become too impatient to maximize their earnings, and it's short-sighted. By taking the job that pays, let's say the starting pay is $50,000 in job A, and maybe it's it's a more established company, it's a little bit higher status, and there's another opportunity that's much lower paid, but it's at a slightly riskier, like maybe an earlier stage startup. At face value, just looking at pay and status, like job A seems better, and you're just looking at like this, this snapshot in time. If you play that out over a handful of years, that $50,000 job most likely your realistic probability to increase your income is like marginally. Like we're talking like 3 to 5% cost of living adjustment year over year. What is that? Where are you at after 5 years? In giant corporation, how much progress can you make in the professional sense too, in terms of like promotions? Compared to if you're willing to take allow the financial and status considerations take a backseat to, is this a great opportunity? Am I going to be learning? Am I going to be in proximity to people that I can learn a ton from, like whether informal or formal mentors? Am I going to actually have real responsibilities? Am I going to have the opportunity to work on things that actually make a difference in the business? What is the growth trajectory of the company? And what does that mean for my possible growth trajectory as a professional?
Yeah.
And if you ask all those questions and let's say there's positive answers, like, yeah, you're going to be surrounded by really competent people who are farther ahead of you in their career. They're doing the kind of things that you want to do, and they're rock stars. You're going to learn from them day in, day out. The company is on a breakneck pace of growth. And so your role is going to be changing constantly over the next, few years because the company's succeeding. They're doing great work. They're working on something you're excited by, and you're going to have as much responsibility as you can possibly stand to handle. And if you crush that, like you deliver, that naturally means that as the company grows, you're going to have the opportunity to make giant leaps and strides in both income and status. And what does that mean? Well, in that type of trajectory, it's not uncommon that your income could rapidly accelerate past even sort of, where this other job was. And, at the end of 5 years in an environment like that compared to the other one, you're in a wildly better spot. Plus you have actually, more tangible skills. You have more actual experience. You've worked on bigger things. You've had more responsibility. You have a much stronger relationship with people who are much more willing to put their necks out for you, to make introductions. You have like a much larger reservoir of social capital. Plus, like if the company's successful, like maybe you got some stock options or something, and like there's a financial event like that, I wouldn't say count those chickens before they hatch or anything. So those aren't the only other things though. Again, like your risk tolerance maybe that like you're just comfortable phoning it in at work, and like you got a steady pay. Your true passion lies outside of work. Having that steady income and a job that isn't really intellectually taxing, it enables you to have some predictability so that you can focus on doing the other things outside of work. And so like this is where I think the conversation is really important, is you begin to think of like your life and career holistically rather than these single dimensions of like just income, just status, and even just like growth opportunities. It's like, what do I want to be doing? Not just in my day job, but like, what do I want my life to look like, today? What do I want it to look like in a year? What do I want it to look like in 5 years? What do I anticipate I want my life to look like 10 years from now? If my, as I change life stages, if you're in your early 20s and you're, single, no kids, no obligations, what you want today is wildly different from what you're going to want 5 to 10 years from now. But you don't just get to sow the fruit from those trees that you didn't plant.
Yeah.
Like you can't just like snap your fingers when you're in your 30s and you're married and you have kids and you have all these, your cost of living is higher, and like have all the things you want if you weren't sacrificing to make sure that you were in a good spot for that. So again, I'm not trying to be a doomsday or anything. I think that, I'm not saying like you should totally sacrifice your youth to your job or your career. But I do think that when most of us talk about careers, especially culturally, we tend to do it one-dimensionally or, two-dimensionally. It's typically these extrinsic things that matter more. Is your job, does it sound impressive? Is it, whether you make a lot of money or not, do people think that you make, pretty good money?
Yeah.
do people think that you're financially successful? And like, all of the other stuff is way more important most of the time, but like,
Yeah.
that's not how we tend to keep score culturally. And so, all of those things are important. I want to add in one more wrinkle here. So this is something I have been thinking about a lot lately. And it's one of those like interesting things that I don't think I really thought through enough when I was younger, but I've really begun to appreciate this as I've gotten older, and I have more data set about my like age cohort. So like my peer group across time, where they're at today, where a lot of my, good friends are today that, I forged those relationships years and years and years ago. And even like to an extent, the relationships that I have today that are directly a result of like what work I do. And this plays into the conversation about the factors, other important factors than compensation when it comes to your career is, to an extent, the choices you make about your career path directly select who your peer group is going to be. Definitely your professional peer group. So like, you want to be a doctor, you know who you're going to probably spend time with? Other doctors. And part of that is like, I'll use the doctor thing for a second. Part of that is like, you're going to work really, really hard for a really long time with this very tight knit, like this very small group of people, which are other medical school students who then go to residency. And like, that's going to be your life. That's going to be your whole social circle, because it's going to be all consuming.
Yeah.
But then there's also the sort of socioeconomic implications of that decision too, is at some point you're going to have a very high income. You may have a ton of student debt too, but you're going to have some very high income. And there's going to be this somewhat implicit expectation that you appear a certain way to society. This is the same for people who work in high finance, lawyers, doctors, like sort of those traditional like high status career paths. Is that, if you're a doctor, like, I'll just give you kind of a hypothetical here. Do you want the lawyer that pulls up? You're going to choose a lawyer. You're going to choose like a heart surgeon. Like, do you want the guy that pulls up in like a 30-year-old Toyota Camry with like rust all over the sides, and it looks like it's just totally falling apart, and he like gets out of the car and he looks like he's wearing like discount bargain clothes and just looks totally disheveled, but like, hey, maybe he's just really frugal and he lives in like an obscure house, just nondescript, nothing out of the ordinary. Do you want that person, or do you want the person who sends this sort of high status signal with their appearance, with their lifestyle? And again, I'm not saying that is actually indicative of quality, but it is somewhat the expectation is that you want the appearance of success in some of those career paths. Like, that's part of the currency of success in that. And so how does that actually come into play is that, and there's actually an interesting study in this. I think the book, The Millionaire Next Door, is a great one. Thomas J. Stanley, they did a study about this. Is like, they interviewed all these people who were millionaires, and specifically among like high net worth individuals. Some subset of that was like doctors, lawyers, people in high finance, and what they were surprised to find is like how expensive lifestyle creep was among that group, because they were surrounded constantly by other people who were in these high status careers. And so it was always this kind of perpetual game of keeping up with the Joneses. And so to some extent, making that decision is determining your peer group. And that can be I'm not saying that that's necessarily a negative peer group. Like, you're making tons of money, like you can afford to do a lot of those things. But even outside of those high status groups, you are to some degree choosing the types of people that you're going to rub shoulders with. And another good example, sort of on the other end of the spectrum, I grew up very blue collar. My family worked in the blue collar world, and here's a directly applicable example: is I had a front row seat, or a window into sort of this path. And I remember my dad, he's told me this versions of the story all the time. It's like he went to college, he thought he was going to do something else. My grandfather ran an electrical contracting business. My dad had worked construction and some experience doing the electrical work, whatever, during the summers. And he came out of college, middle of a recession. The types of career paths that he thought he wanted to pursue, it wasn't really a lot of economic activity happening. So he went to work for, my grandpa doing electrical work. And he said the first few years, like, it was brutal because, one, he kind of got made fun of for being the college educated boy, but part of the challenge in that particular profession is like there are a lot of people that just, again, I don't mean to come across negative, and I don't think that this is necessarily true in general of trades work, but I think that there was always something like the types of people that tend to be attracted to this type of job and like what they're interested in and like the thing. And again, I'm not saying this has anything to do with intelligence whatsoever. Like this may come across like I'm being pompous, and I'm totally not. What I'm saying is, like, these are the people you're going to be spending all of your time with, the people that you're working with in the profession that you choose. And that doesn't mean you're not going to have friendships outside of that.
Yeah.
But to some degree, you're going to pick up the mannerisms. You're going to be influenced by these people. And like, is this group of people, sort of this peer group, are the people that energize you, challenge you? Are they not? And I think there are plenty of examples of that in the trades. Again, I'm not trying to like throw shade or anything like that. But just like the other end of the spectrum, where I'm talking about like you've decided to be a doctor, you're surrounding yourself with a bunch of doctors. I know a lot of doctors that I wouldn't want to hang out with or have a beer with in a conversation with it either. So like it's true of every profession.
Yeah.
Is that it's going to attract a certain type of people. So I'll give you one that's I'd say somewhat in the middle of this is like going into sales. I think there's already this like negative perception of what, people in sales are like. And I think the general public sort of culturally has a negative view of sales in general because they don't understand it. And maybe they've been on the wrong side of too many bad sales transactions as well. But there's sort of this perception of like what a salesperson is, and they're like shysters and like sleazy people. And, most salespeople that I know and have great relationships, totally not what they're like.
Right.
But to some degree, at least if you're surrounding yourself with like successful salespeople, like that's a great cohort of people in terms of like people who are highly competitive. They probably are a little status driven, a little bit income driven, but typically, the really high performers, this is probably true across every career path of high performers, is like they want to get better. And for every one of those people, regardless of which career path you're in, there's going to be a lot of people who are, probably not like that. So again, this is just, this isn't like an actionable thing that I say, hey, you should think about what type of person chooses particular career paths, and that should totally influence your decision. But it's more of one of those interesting observations is I've just thought about where a lot of my friends are who are in different career paths and sort of the type, like even what their environments are like. Some of my friends who are attorneys and, very, very successful, and like work-life balance is that's a joke. That's not something you get, but like they're surrounded by people who are also very, very competent, and it's a very cutthroat environment, and that's the peer group you're in. And sort of that's the social infrastructure in that career path, is that there's a very small margin for error in your day-to-day operation. And it's a very intense career path. And that's sort of who you're spending your time with day in and day out. Again, this is just something conversational, like observational, that I've been thinking about as I've gotten older, how that sort of plays into your career choices.
I think in all of that you talked about there, you get it. One of the one common theme there is that, and you may have said this, it's not when you're choosing a career path, or just not like you have to choose one particular, right? But like when you're choosing a career path, it's not a binary decision. Like it's not just like, or it's not just or a one-dimensional decision. It's got there's a lot of different factors that go into it. Like compensation is one of them, but based on your life, you have to understand, you have to be able to make a decision about how high that ranks, because it's basically like, let's just say we picked like 2 or 3: compensation, peer group, and I'll use the term work-life balance, but meaning it depends on that all depends on your goals. So if you use those 3, they can't all be at the best. It can't all be optimal. You're gonna have to have a priority system. So like if compensation is one and you're early in your career, well then work-life balance, like time outside of work or outside of the constraints of the office you work at, you're not going to get that as an option if compensation is up high, because the most valuable thing you have early in your career is your time, because that's meaning you haven't captured enough experience to make your time super valuable per hour. So for you to accrue a lot of income, you need to put in a lot of time. So that's where you'll sacrifice the work-life balance. And then to the peer group thing, it's kind of like that's maybe middle of the road. Like just find people that you jive with personality wise. And then if your compensation is your priority, then that's going to be like, okay, like it doesn't really matter. But that being said, those 3 things those are 3 like strong, I would say, factors when making that decision. I think this is something I've been thinking about lately, Mitchell, just in conversation with people in general, and I think it's just something like my generation in particular, but maybe, I'm sure millennials the same way. I'm sure it was like this before, maybe not as much, but there's a level of entitlement early in your career, and it's not necessarily their fault. It's kind of just like what's been taught and what's been programmed into them.
Yeah.
But a lot of people my age, and I've been there, right? Like I'm sure I've had moments like this and like, had to be checked. Like I think honestly, like early in my career, like you had checked me on it. Like when I was like writing some stuff or trying to make a decision, like you had helped me with this. And it's like, there's very much so a comparison to like, oh, like this position in this industry makes this much, I'm only making this much, or this and that. And it's like, you got to slow down and realize like that in the grand scheme of your life and career, it's going to be a marginal difference anyway, because what you really should be focused on early on is those experiences. Hey, what am I learning? How can I take what I'm doing now for work and bring that into building something that is more valuable, so that 5 years from now, like it's kind of like I'm going to make, my time is worth a ton. So this so-and-so is going to want to pay me a lot because, I provide X amount of value. And just shifting to that mindset of, it's not just like, oh, you make a ton of money because you have this job. It's more like, no, this business is structured a certain way. The role that I'm in either generates enough revenue to where that my percentage of that revenue is high, or the role I'm in frees up another area of the business to generate revenue, which is still, that role is generating revenue. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think that's something too, that when you're too focused on compensation, you really open yourself up to entitlement, which is it's a horrible thing to do, because you really stunt your growth, because you're only focused on, well, I deserve this much, and this is what I'm worth now, and this is what this position makes across the board, and you're not accessing and thinking about all the positive aspects of the learning experiences, which is so common. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. You've been working with young adults for a number of years now, and I mean, has that been your experience? I feel like you've probably run into that quite a bit.
I definitely have. And I mean, I was guilty of this coming out of college and early on in my career to some degree. And, so part of it is just sort of the inherent entitlement of younger generations. And I don't even necessarily mean that in a negative way, but sort of this idea, especially in the United States, where we've grown up at least implicitly believing, if not explicitly being told, that the future is always going to be better. And we've talked about this to some degree, but like the future is going to be better and that things always get better. And like your generation should have it better off than our generation had it. And like older generations always kind of joking about like, when I was your age, it was hard. And so there's just kind of this like cultural bias that like things are going to get better. It's going to be easier for the next generation. So that has certainly not panned out over the past 30 years. Not to say that like the standard of living hasn't gone up, because it has, but earnings have been stagnant. The cost of college has just totally skyrocketed. So one of the byproducts is like degree inflation, sort of jobs that used to require this amount of experience plus, allegedly they list this degree. They now want this degree that's higher. All of that aside, like there's still ways to access school opportunities. But I think part of it is also still this cultural identity that is so tied up in sort of the academic managerial class way of thinking about things. And so part of this is you're an average early 20-something who's gone through the college industrial complex conveyor belt, and you're spit out into the real world suddenly. And for 22 years, you have been taught that the way the world works is that you follow the rules, you do the homework, your compensation is a good grade. And so you go out in the real world and you think that I show up for work, I do what's expected of me, my compensation is a good grade. I get an A+ compensation because I did what was expected of me. And the expectation kind of bundled with that is I was told to follow this traditional path regardless of the cost. My education would be worth it. And I would see immediate dividends because this degree would set me apart and make me valuable, contributing member to society. It would make me an in-demand employee. And I have this somewhat implicit expectation. Also, this was explicitly communicated to me my entire life, that if I do these things, I should be able to have a reasonable standard of living.
Yeah.
Except you took on a ton of student debt. People don't really care about degrees. They don't really see that as like the valuable thing. And that's certainly not the thing in many, again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but like, that's not certainly the thing that's going to convince somebody to give you a big fat salary. Outside of going to like a tier 1 school and then pursuing, the direct paths. And part of that is more about the social status of those institutions, as opposed to like the average person go to the average state school. Like it's not opening a ton more doors. At best, you're maybe seeing a slightly marginal improvement in starting earnings if you are able to get hired. But I think the average graduate, they're somewhat alarmed that their whole life they've been doing these things, and they at least had this expectation of like, if I spend 4 years and $100,000 to go to school, especially if that's debt, like I'm going to have great starting earnings. Like I should be worth this much. All of that aside, an entitlement isn't entirely young people's faults. Like to some extent, I think we were all probably at some point in our lives a little bit guilty of this. Heaven knows I certainly was, but it's this idea of I've been told to follow the rules, and here's my just compensation is an A+. And I think it's very difficult to accept that, in this new reality out in the real world, the way we keep grades, the way we keep score, it's not grades. It's typically financial status or, financial, your financial standing and your social status. And that doesn't directly translate to the same inputs, which is show up, follow the rules, do the homework. That's not what gets an A+ financial, financial outcome. It's how valuable are you? How much value can you create? How much value can you convince somebody that you're capable of creating? And then, can you deliver that in perpetuity over time? But, I think that all of that is, it's an important mindset, like the more I think younger people, younger generations just become aware of that. Like that's really the currency of the real world, especially in context to all these other things we just talked about, the values they have when they're thinking about their careers.
Yeah.
It begins to change the way you're thinking about pathing into the future. If like, maybe not only is college maybe not the right step for what I want to do, it may not be necessary at all, but what am I really trying to accomplish here? Like, what do I want my life to look like? And what's the optimal route to getting there?
Yeah. No, it's good. Well, let's shift gears here. to an adjacent topic, but sort of different. It's actually a listener question, so I'm excited to dive into this one. It says something along the lines of, Mitchell, you often talk about how important it is to, just get things out there, projects, whatnot. Don't wait for it to be perfect. Lots of good enough is better than one perfect thing shipped out. But you also talk about how it's very important to, sweat the small details and, in a new job, and be like meticulous and give everything your very best. Pay attention to the minute things that maybe others aren't paying attention to. Do you think those are contradictory? And if not, where and how do you find that balance?
Fantastic question. I really appreciate this question, and I appreciate any opportunity to clear up seemingly contradictory statements that I've made with different content that I put out. And so I think that, a lot of the times the best career advice does seem contradictory, but they're actually, it's not necessarily. I don't think that this is contradictory advice. And I want to kind of break it down. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got like, you should seek to have high attention to detail. You should like be totally reliable. You should aim for perfection, even though perfection's a myth. On the other end, it's like, you should get so good at shipping and delivering output and just getting reps and not waiting for perfect. Instead, aiming for just being a massive contributor, creating, like, have a really high volume of output. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the perfection side of the spectrum first. So on that end, I think for most people, when they're young, when they're early in their careers, especially if you're a traditional kind of schooled mindset, like, you're kind of approaching your career as an extension of school, the next step in schooling, which is like, I'm here to get a good grade. I'm here to impress people. And I want to make sure I follow all the rules. And I want to make sure that my boss gives me an A+ and a big bright red A+, and then they hang it on the, company refrigerator so everybody can see, and they think really highly of me. Nobody wants to work with that person. Like, that mindset, the person who's status seeking, or they want constant praise or constant validation about their work, or they need to constantly be told what to do. So in terms of like sweating the small details, here's why it's important. A boss told me this one time. I love this advice. Early in my career, it's like, everybody tells you that there's no such thing as a stupid question, but there is such thing as a stupid question. It's the question you have to ask twice. You should never have to ask. If you want to be a high performer, you should be a knowledge sponge. It is totally okay to ask questions. And the same boss, in sort of, extended breakdown of this, that point of advice, he's like, there's sort of this natural curve when you're starting a new job, especially when you're early in your career. It's like right at the start, your volume of questions should be way up here. And then over time, it should dip off. And that doesn't mean that you should stop asking questions, but it's sort of that line that we're charting is this sort of percentage of required questions to be able to do your job remarkably well. It should decline over time. And then the quality of your question should probably go up as well. But you're not asking questions about like how to do your job anymore. That should decline over time. But there is in every job, especially the earlier on in your career, there's sort of this natural and finite window where like anything goes. You ask as many questions as you want. You like ask everything. But the caveat is, you shouldn't be asking the same questions twice, because you're now showing that you're like not paying attention. Like, you should be obsessed with learning how to crush it at the job and how to over deliver. And to that extent, that's what I'm saying. You should sweat all the small details. You should make sure that you know exactly what excellent quality work output looks like in the role that you're hired with.
Yeah.
And especially early on in your career, because this is also a finite window of time, there are not really high expectations of you early on in your career. And the surest way to learn is through making mistakes. And in order to learn very quickly and in order to learn a lot, you need to make a lot of mistakes. And the faster you can accelerate sort of that mistake cycle, the faster you're going to learn over a shorter span of time. And this is where I kind of say this idea of like shipping. And again, it's not just limited to the start of your career, but this is sort of the start of any new domain you're entering.
Yeah.
Is no one's going to expect you to be an expert when you're first starting something out. But if you just sort of half-ass something, let's say, you start a new career path. Let's use sales. We talk about sales all the time, but let's say you like get hired in sales, and to the outside world, you have a sales title on your LinkedIn, and for 5 years, you continue to have sales titles. And as far as anyone else is concerned, you're doing good. You must be doing good because you're continuing to work in this industry. You haven't been fired. You haven't been pushed out of sales. But let's just say you're like a C+ player. And you're just like you're just doing enough not to get fired. Like you hit quota every third quarter, and then like the rest of the time you're like good enough, and like you're not a top performer. You're maybe not the worst, but you're just like getting by. The expectation of you 5 years into your career is that you should be a professional. But if you've just kind of like ho-hummed for 5 years, you really don't have 5 years of experience. You probably have like 1 year of experience 5 times. Compared to the person. That's right. Compared to the person who's compounding that 5 years, like I am iterating. I'm learning as quickly as I can. I am over and over and over again. I'm testing things, and I'm making a ton of mistakes, or maybe not mistakes, but I'm getting a lot of reps trying things and figuring out what doesn't work. And over time, I'm getting better and better and better, and I'm just shipping stuff. And I think honestly, those are the people who learn the most, and they become more valuable. And truly, like at the end of 5 years for that person, they probably have way more than 5 years of experience, especially compared against the average person who's, they're repeating the same 1 year of experience over and over again. Like you are so like growth like that doesn't happen linearly. It happens exponentially.
Yeah.
And so on the ends of these spectrums, I don't think they're contradictory. You should be the person who is striving for perfection, and you are as quickly as possible. You're trying to identify the parameters of excellence. Like, what does it take to be excellent in this role? And I am going to sweat all of the details and make sure that I absolutely nail that. In addition to that, in my path to excellence, not just today, but excellence forevermore into the future, I'm going to hustle. I'm going to continue to learn. I'm going to be somebody who's like totally unafraid of being embarrassed by my lack of knowledge. And so I'm going to continue to just try stuff. And I'm going to approach everything without this sense of like that schooled mindset of like, oh, well, they didn't say this is the way that it's been done, so I'm not even going to try it. That's like totally out of bounds. There's just going to be somebody who's like, you know what? Have we tried it this way? You know what? You know what? I'm just going to try it. I'm going to see what happens. You're throwing spaghetti at the wall and you're seeing what sticks, and you're doing that over and over and over again. That's how those pieces of advice, I actually think that they're very complementary rather than contradictory, but it's sort of both of those bundled together that I think is the true mark of an aspiring professional that actually reaches their goal, in the future.
It's the optimal growth combination there. Basic analogy here, and you can live critique it because it's, these are kind of your points and maybe the analogy doesn't work, but I started to think about it because one of the things you said was about the questions, and the only stupid question is the one you have to ask twice, and you probably had this experience. Coaches, right? Like good sports coaches would be like, they could have a temper, right? But they'd be a good coach is willing to work with you, wants to be patient with you, but you got to be coachable, and you have to be able to retain what they taught you. So you shouldn't be making the same like fine motor mistakes multiple times in a row. Like once you correct, like if your throwing motion was off and he corrected it, and you've had some reps practice, like you shouldn't go back to that mistake, right? That's the idea. Well, I was thinking about it. It's like trying to get better at shooting a basketball. I'm not going to get better at shooting a basketball if I'm okay. My form should be just right, and it takes me 5 minutes in between reps, right? I'm not going to get better.
Yep.
But I'm also not going to get better if my form sucks and I just shoot 100 shots like that a bunch of times. I might get a little bit better. Like maybe I start making more, because you can get good at a bad strategy. Like a bad strategy can work. And actually, you might argue that one is better than the other one still. But the optimal is, hey, like my form, I'm winging my arm out. I should bring it in. And like just being mindful of those small details and adjusting. And I'm going to shoot. And maybe I'm missing still, but okay, I'm making adjustments as I go. And like, I didn't mean to turn it into a sports analogy, but it made me think it's like, that's what it is. That's how they work together, is you're adjusting as you go, you're iterating. You want to be mindful of all these small little factors affect whether or not this shot goes in. But I can't know or see it unless I'm actually shooting. And it takes reps to do that, but they both have to be happening at the same time. And I think that's kind of how it works with your career.
Oh man, I love this. You just opened another can of worms for me. So there's like a handful of things I want to break down. Like shooting the basketball is totally relevant right now. It's funny. I ran into my old basketball coach the other day, and he was like cracking jokes about how, how when he first became our coach, we had to like totally redo my shot, because like I had never really nailed the fundamentals when I was younger, and like this was very deliberate effort. It took a lot of time. And, I would go to the gym, like literally my dad would drive me out to the school gym at like 5 a.m. every single day. And I would go and I would shoot, and I would do these shooting drills. And it was this like almost obsessive compulsive level of, I'm going to start literally right underneath the goal, and I'm going to shoot 10 shots, and I'm going to be focused on form. And then I'm going to move to the block, and I'm going to do 10 shots focused on form. And then I'm going to move to the next hash mark and do it, literally repeat it and go around the horn and do that over and over and over again. And I did that for like a year, not every single morning for a year, but like for a year, I was deliberately focused on that. And eventually, my form got a little bit better, and I was never great at basketball. But it's funny that you brought that up, because I was thinking about that run-in just happened the other day. In the context of what you're talking about, there's like the Malcolm Gladwell rule, what does it take to be an expert? And they say it's 10,000 hours of practice.
Yeah.
And it's not 10,000 hours of practice, as it turns out. It's 10,000 hours of focused practice, of focused, deliberate attention to your craft. It's not like what we talked about earlier. It's not 5 years. It's not 1 year of experience repeated 5 times. It's deliberate, intentional practice over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And in the context of your career, and especially this question that we asked about this contrast between like perfection seeking versus like ruthlessly get it done and ship stuff. There's this phrase that I really like, which is, you need to learn the rules before you break the rules. And this is really relevant for writing, is a good example that I'll use to illustrate this. And it's certainly relevant in sports, but like in order to become a really good writer, you could just sit down and start writing. But if you really want to progress, like it does help to learn the rules, at least of the language you're trying to communicate in. Like how do other people communicate?
Yeah.
What's really good writing? I want to go study a lot of really good writing. Maybe you actually go learn the actual hard rules of, you probably need to learn how to spell. Probably need to learn basic grammar, but like you don't necessarily need to learn like all of the intense English, and literature, and
everything I write is in MLA format these days. I'm always using MLA format, APA style.
You don't need to necessarily know all of them, but you need to at least have a basic command of the rules before you start breaking them. And I think even a lot of my favorite writers, they don't follow all the rules, but you know what they've done? They've achieved a level of mastery that they know how to break the rules in a masterful way that doesn't get in the way of their intended outcome.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't get in the way of their communication style. In fact, if anything, it enhances the experience for readers, or it increases the sort of fidelity of the output of the content. I think the same thing is true for, young professionals or people learning any new skill, pursuing any new craft. Is you need to understand what excellence requires, sort of universally understood excellence in this role first, before you just start trying to like go off on a tangent and recreate everything. And to an extent, this goes back to what we were talking about entitlement earlier, is this idea of like, how arrogant do you have to be somebody who's brand new at something and think that you can just start doing everything your own way, and you know better than all of the people who have been doing this for a long time. Learn from the experts first, and make sure that you have obsessed over the details of learning what excellence looks like and feels like and requires first. And then and only then you can iterate.
Yeah.
You should still iterate a lot in your process. Like, you should still iterate on your path to even understanding excellence. But like, sometimes you got to learn the rules before you break them.
Gotta learn the rules before you break them. I like it. Well, I feel like we covered a lot of good ground here today. So I feel like we could probably wrap it here. Mitchell, I like your close, so I'll hand it back over to you, where you kind of invite everybody to,
Yeah, as always, everybody, thanks for listening. Hopefully that we didn't get too far off the rails today, but if you ever have comments, questions, concerns, ideas for future topics, shoot us an email, playbook@discoverpraxis.com. Drop us a comment if you're listening on YouTube. Feel free to leave us a 5-star review so more people can find this. Don't hesitate to share links to podcasts with friends or family, or somebody, if there's somebody in your life that you feel like would benefit, or maybe they've been encountering some of the challenges that we talk about. As always, we're happy to consider whatever feedback you have. Shoot us an email, leave us a comment. But we will be back again soon. Thanks as always for listening.